Women and women's trauma are fetishized, belittled, exploited, treated with contempt, and outright dismissed so often that I think people would rather do anything instead of actually validating and listening to a woman about her experiences. I'm much more used to bad depictions of women going through trauma in fiction than I am of good ones. And that's where the subject of today's video comes in. Felisin Paran is one of several main characters in the 2000 fantasy novel Deadhouse Gates. And even in a cast of already stellar individuals, she stood out to me as the finest. This video is meant to be a character study and, in some ways, a defense of Felisin as a character. Both emotionally and intellectually, there are a lot of layers to parse through. We're going to be dealing with very sensitive topics, so I will simply just not engage with anyone who is commenting in bad faith, who tries to victim blame. I will just ignore you and block you from commenting on my channel ever again. Not that it normally happens in my comment section, but I just want to make that crystal clear. As always, thank you so much for watching my videos and supporting my channel, and please make sure to subscribe for more video essays like this. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to be limiting my analysis to the first two books in the series, since those are the only two books I've read. Obviously, as I keep reading, my opinions might evolve and I might have a change of heart towards certain characters, but for now, I think there's more than enough material for me to sift through in these first two books. First of all, I want to talk about Apsalar and certain similarities between the character of Apsalar and Felisin. For much of book one, I found Apsalar to be interesting, but not more so than the average character. The biggest drawback to her was the fact that she wasn't herself at all. She was possessed for the majority of the novel. It wasn't made clear how much control, if any, she had. And if you're looking at the book through a gendered lens, Apsalar was one of the three main characters who were women that had POVs throughout the book. The fact that you don't know how much of it is actually her for a large portion of the book effectively pares that number down to 2. Then when you combine that with the fact that those two women either end up dead or essentially dead by the end of the book, it's not necessarily a good look. It definitely caused me to have some reservations about Malazan. I wasn't overly vocal about these reservations because, well, Gardens of the Moon is the first book in a 10-book series. I wasn't going to make a harsh judgment about the series' portrayal of women when I had only really read 10%. But still, I had those thoughts in the back of my head, and it's almost like Steven Erikson heard me saying that 21 years in the future, because he directly addresses those concerns in Deadhouse Gates. Not only did this quote lay to rest my biggest criticism with Apsalar, that she didn't have any agency being a vessel of an ascendant, but it also works to assert that the same would be true for Felisin, who at this point in the book is about to enter into an agreement of a sorts with the goddess Shaik. This similarity is further enforced by the way that the narrative sets up the plot twist of Felisin becoming Shaik reborn instead of Apsalar. If you'll recall, throughout the novel it had been Apsalar who was explicitly being set up to become the next leader of the apocalypse. This creates a direct line between the two characters. They're both being used by gods, but by the same token, they can also use those gods to their advantage. It's not a one-for-one parallel, but I really appreciated that confirmation that even though they are possessed, they still retain some form of agency. I also really liked the interconnectedness of their story, despite the fact that they had never met in person and they spend the majority of the story thousands of miles apart. And as a whole, I think that Malazan is exceptional for the way that it relates seemingly unrelated events and characters together, binding them under the umbrella of a cohesive narrative. And so with that concern out of the way, I kind of trust Erikson a lot more as a writer. It's a bit of an understatement to say that Felisin goes through hell in this book. She's raped, she's drugged, beaten, starved, and even attacked by a swarm of sorcerous bugs. And yet it never quite feels like torture porn or gratuitous when these things are happening on the page. There are those writers who hide behind the excuse that historically women have been raped, and so they think that it gives them the pass to subject their female characters to violence, all while glorifying the act and never actually examining the consequences that the assault begets. The realism excuse holds even less water when it comes to fantasy, a genre defined by dragons and magic. Verisimilitude is important, of course, but but I have to wonder, why is it always women who are killed or raped in violent ways to show how evil the villain is? Sometimes writers will even throw in a little girl boss feel-good moment where the woman reflects about how the rape made her stronger. But as a whole, the consequences of rape are rarely, if ever, fully explored to the extent that they need to be. Felisin breaks that mold. For one thing, the depiction of the assault in the book is never drawn out or described in detail. Erikson almost always refers to the act as it happened in the past, or he starts the scene at the very end of it. There is no room for voyeurism. Furthermore, the narrative is always centered around Felisin and only her. Her experiences aren't reduced to motivations for other characters' actions or even her actions. In fact, her motivation is made clear from the very beginning, but when we're told that her sister, adjunct Tavor, has betrayed her and that she wants to get revenge on her. In this regard, rape as it is portrayed here is not simply for shock value. There are nuances to her experiences and ways in which she resists. For example, she convinces her rapist Benneth to give her friend Eboric an easier job so that the old man might actually survive. And even before that, she saved Eboric and Bowden's lives by gaining access to a cleaner part of the slave ship that they were all on. This fact that Eboric and Bowden owe her their lives cannot be overstated, and it also makes the subsequent gaslighting and eventual rape that Felisin endures at the hands of Bowden that much more sick. As the novel continues and they escape from the slave mines, Felisin experiences a slow descent into paranoia as her companions shame her for her addiction and abuse. Bowden in particular repeatedly asserts that she didn't want to leave, and this part was really difficult to read because it felt like such a direct comment on the way that victims are so often blamed for their own traumas. And for a while, I was extremely wary as I wasn't sure whether or not Erikson was trying to make a comment about victim blaming or whether or not he was actually victim blaming Felisin. But I think thanks to very careful writing that keeps the narrative in support of Felisin, the book itself never actually victim blames her. One of the few assaults that are actually depicted in their entirety in this novel occur at the hands of Bowden. And make no mistake, that scene is indeed a rape scene. There's nothing romantic or protective about the relationship between Bowden and Felisin. It's always about power. To paraphrase a quote from Oscar Wilde, everything is sex except sex, which is power. In that scene, Felisin tries to use sex as a way to overpower Bowden, who she thinks is conspiring against her. The scene culminates with Bowden revealing that he knew all along that she had stolen his knife. Instead of simply confronting her and taking the knife back, he chose instead to dominate her in his own display of power. This scene is significant because it cements Bowden as a truly reprehensible person. During this whole segment, I just couldn't get over the fact that Felisin is a child. She's 16 years old. In this situation, Bowden is the adult. He even goes so far as to admit that he could have helped her and Eboric escape much earlier if he had so chosen. He both enables and directly participates in Felisin's abuse, and he is just a despicable character. The narrative supports this, and that's the final point that I want to make about Bowden. He is literally and figuratively a stand-in for Tavor. His character serves to develop the struggle for power between the two sisters, even as Tavor is like barely in this book. When Bowden dies a horrible death, torn to shreds and devoured by rats, you can interpret that gruesome ending as both the narrative condemning him for his role in Felisin's trauma, but also as the death of any chance of reconciliation between Tavor and Felisin. Meanwhile, Felisin survives, and the story does a fantastic job of actually exploring the various consequences of her trauma. Her journey isn't reduced down to some sort of feel-good girl boss moment, even as she ascends to become the next goddess of the apocalypse. Like I mentioned earlier, this is only the second book in a 10-book series, and it's clear that the conflict between Felisin and Tavor has only just started, and we've only just started to see the effects of trauma on Felisin. But as a self-contained arc, this was one of the most harrowing and compelling stories I've ever read. Congratulations if you've made it this far into the video. If you can believe it, I still have a lot more to say about Felisin, But here I'd like to touch on a broader topic that's been bothering me for a while. The double standard of likability when it comes to women in fiction. I think we can all agree that a good character doesn't always have to be likable. Some characters are designed to be hated, and that's the point. But that's not what I'm discussing here. What I'm talking about is the tendency for female characters to be disliked, called bitches, and just piled on for genuine trauma responses or character traits that are celebrated in male characters. I've seen this time and time again, from Egwene in Wheel of Time to Sansa Stark to Felisin. Women are degraded for having the audacity to not always be perfectly pleasant, sometimes by the narrative and sometimes by the fandom. Felisin goes through a lot of shit in this book, but she also displays incredible perseverance. She's thorny and closed off because she quite literally cannot trust anyone around her. She's a scared child who's out of her depth. Calling her a bitch or unlikable without recognizing the entire context of her story is one of the most heartless takes I can think of. It goes beyond simple misogyny. It's like you're denying her humanity. This was by no means an easy video essay to write. It literally took me 3 tries to get this down, and even now I'm not sure if I did Felisin justice, but I had to at least try. And